15 seconds, 16 seconds, fucking wow. And shit is still loading. Unfucking real. God, you're such a fucking raging piece of garbage. Words cannot describe how much I fucking hate this fucking piece of shit. I am a very, very angry cranky panda. Stupid piece of shit. Are you fucked? Like, what the fuck? This is... Fucking just pinch my fucking finger. Fuck, I hate you. Fuck, I hate you so fucking much. Yep. Fucking Cortana.
And now to week 2 of the Ghislaine Maxwell trial here in Manhattan. Today, a woman testified about her decades-long interactions with Maxwell and the late Jeffrey Epstein. News 4's Erica Byfield was there for what that witness said, Erica, that it was the hardest thing she's ever had to do.
Yeah, Adam, she actually kind of welled up and was sobbing at points. But first, let me tell you, I want all of our viewers to hear about this. The last witness of the day, FBI agent, she was talking about raiding Epstein's mansion here in New York City in July of 2019. She talked about what exactly they found inside. She said that they found binders full of images and CDs and hard drives. She said were also tucked away in closets. We also found out that they actually were able to find a huge blue safe. Inside of that, they found cash, passports, loose jewelry, including more binders filled with CDs and more hard drives. Earlier today, as you mentioned, Adam, there was a woman who took the stand, and she testified about what she says happened to her at 17. Her age here is key because she was over the age of consent, so Maxwell is not charged with what she says happened. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell traveled in the same high-profile social circles as lovers and later as boss and employee. Prosecutors say for at least a decade, while out of the spotlight, the pair trafficked and abused girls. Maxwell denies that. On Monday, the feds called someone identified as Kate to the stand, a British former model. She said that she met Maxwell and Epstein at 17 in London. She told the jurors that Maxwell asked her to regularly give Epstein sexual massages, saying that Maxwell praised her. She asked me if I had fun and told me that I was such a good girl and told me I was one of his favorites. Kate said that Maxwell asked her to recruit other girls. She said, "You know what he likes, cute, young, pretty, like you." Kate said that she did not do that. She did say that she traveled with Maxwell and Epstein to the Virgin Islands and his Palm Beach mansion. In Florida, she described a time where Maxwell left a costume on her bed. It was a schoolgirl outfit. She said, "I thought it would be fun for you to take Jeffrey his tea in the outfit." Last week, we learned that FBI agents raided Epstein's New York City townhouse in 2019 and found similar outfits. The defense didn't want the jury to know about that. The judge said that she'd allow it. On Monday, the defense went after Kate's credibility, bringing up embarrassing moments like her past drug and alcohol abuse. About testifying, Kate said this as she sobbed, "This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. The truth is important." Also today, a banker testified. He was talking about many transactions between Epstein and Maxwell. We found out within 3 separate transactions that Epstein actually transferred Maxwell about $30 million. We found out from that banker that Maxwell spent about $7.3 million of those dollars on a green helicopter. From Lower Manhattan, Erica Byfield, News 4, New York.
Kim, what's on your radar?
The second victim out of 4 scheduled to testify in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial took the stand yesterday, giving us more disturbing details as to how Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein recruited the girls and what they were asked to do. According to the Daily Beast, the victim with the alias Kate was 17.
Fucking kid. I'll fucking lose my shit on you. Good time for that. I'm literally gonna fucking lose it. Holy fuck. You're making me mad. Like, really fucking mad.
All right, guys, we've got a new potential Rachel Dolezal or Elizabeth Warren type situation on our hands. This one out of our friendly neighbors to the north. A Canadian woman who had risen to a top-level position within the government has been outed as a fraud. She's been claiming Indigenous heritage for years. Let's go ahead and throw this New York Post tear sheet up on the screen. Canada's Indigenous health expert, Carrie Barassa, loses job when her ancestry claims prove false. Here's the opening bit here. A Canadian medical researcher who rose to become the nation's top voice on Indigenous health has been ousted from her government job and her university professorship after suspicious colleagues investigated her increasingly fanciful claims of Native American heritage and learned she was a fraud. She was suspended on November 1st, 5 days after the state-owned Canadian Broadcasting Corporation published a lengthy expose on her background. I also read the expose because this is one of these stories that I'm just like, why and how do you think you're going to get away with this? Let's go ahead and throw that investigation up on the screen. And effectively, what happened here, as best as we can figure out, is she originally claimed to be part of the Métis Nation, and even convinced her sister that they had this ancestry. She brought in someone who was an expert who gave them some sort of lineage that persuaded the sister, at least for a time, that they did have this Indigenous ancestry. But when colleagues started to get suspicious is when the sister decided, I did my own research and I don't think I can claim this anymore, that this does not seem like it is a true reflection of, where our people ultimately came from. And then you couple with the fact that on top of the initial claims about the Métis ancestry, she started to add on other tribal lineages that she was affiliated with. So let's take a look at, this was a TEDx talk that raised a lot of eyebrows at the time, where she's claiming a lot of different ancestries that it turns out she was not connected to at all. Let's take a look at that.
I'm Bear Clan. I'm an Anishinaabe Métis from Treaty 4 territory, and I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm in, Treaty 6 territory. home to the Cree peoples and homeland of the Métis Nation.
Fucking related.
I also want to acknowledge my ancestors who are clearly here with me.
So it turns out that her people are actually like Russian and Eastern European farmer immigrants.
Which is fine.
Totally fine.
Yeah.
And also that this is the other part that to me was actually the most gross. She also invented this whole childhood of trauma. That look, I don't know if she suffered some trauma or another in her life or not, but what she said is totally inconsistent with who her parents actually are. Apparently, they were successful, well-known, middle-class business owners. She had a stable upbringing, at least from the outside, as far as anyone could tell. Totally opposite the childhood of trauma that she described as rife with violence and addiction and sexual assault and poverty and all of these things. Some of them, I mean, the poverty part is provably false. The ancestry also now provably false. But I just really don't understand. Like, I mean, it seems like she also started leaning more into the traditional dress, which is also part of why her colleagues were like, what are you doing here? And they found it particularly gross, too, that she invented this whole childhood of trauma, which kind of plays into these negative stereotypes of that community. Like every Indigenous person is like, you know, a violent drunk or something like that. And so it's quite incredible. Ultimately,
everything's from like 40 years ago. That's great. Fuck Quebec. Fuck it here. Fuck it here. Fuck it here. Fucking hate all of you. Hope you fucking all get COVID and fucking die slowly. Wow. Unfucking real. Fucking lying fucking pieces of fucking shit.
Hey everyone, this is a clip from my new special called The Pale Tourist, which is streaming exclusively.
Ontario's like, oh, I'll handle this. Quebec is like, you are so idiot. Quebec is so fascinating. It's like Canada's slightly different than it.
Yeah, not fascinating. It's not exactly the fucking word I'd use for it.
Hello, friends. It's me, your old pal, JJ, the guy with all of the controversial opinions on the French Canadians. And today, you are going to hear more of them. So longtime viewers of this channel will know that my YouTube arch nemesis is Thomas Gauthier, the Quebec YouTube superstar, who is way more successful and handsome than me, and I am not jealous of it all. Tom is a very proud defender of French.
Yep. Gonna do fucking everything humanly possible. Fuck.
Hello, friends. It's me, your old pal. Between French Canada and English.
Le pouvoir politique soit le plus possible entre les mains des provinces, tandis que les minorités
Really accelerated Quebec's descent into nationalism. And as Quebec became more nationalistic and its politicians tried to whip up support for the idea of separating from Canada altogether, it became necessary to break any bonds of natural affinity between Quebecers and the rest of Canada. The main way they did this was by passing very strict anti-English laws, which helped Quebec aggressively reject the language of Canada's other 9 provinces. Laws like the infamous Bill 101 of 1977, which have been continuously strengthened over the decades to ensure that French is the sole language of business and commerce and education and public signage. This not only had the effect of reducing and discouraging English fluency among Quebec's French-speaking population, but also reducing the numbers of native English speakers in Quebec. When you live in one of the non-Quebec parts of Canada, as I do, you often come across middle-aged English Quebecers who left the province with their families in like the 70s or 80s. And when you talk to these people in casual conversation, they don't usually feel the need to offer much explanation for why they moved. They usually will just say something like, yeah, I was born in Quebec, but you know, we had to move. And then the other English Canadian he is talking to will always just be like, oh yeah. Because to us, the situation seems very obvious. The writer Mordecai Richler, who is perhaps the most famous English Quebecer of the 20th century, summed up the situation this way.
It's a kind of genteel ethnic cleansing because about 250,000 English-speaking people have left in the last 15 years.
So yes, the Quebecers deliberately remade their province in such a way that it would resemble the rest of Canada as little as possible. But the other way they cut ties was through the business that Thomas talks about, which was the breaking of ties to French Canadians in other parts of Canada. Because Quebec's leadership during the late 20th century really wanted Quebecers to be maîtres chez nous, or masters of their own house, their interest in fighting for French Canadian rights elsewhere in the country declined rapidly. Because why should Quebecers care about French-speaking people in Saskatchewan? Saskatchewan is in a different country, or at least it will be soon enough. Now, Tom clearly does not like this particular legacy of his province, and truth be told, neither do a lot of Quebecers. These days, separatist sentiment in Quebec has declined a lot, and even though the Quebec ruling class is still as hostile to English as ever.
Language tensions are brewing at Montreal's Sacré-Cœur Hospital tonight. Earlier this week, it sent out a letter to employees after receiving complaints about English on its premises.
The hospital declined our request for an interview, but a spokesperson told CTV News, while this letter may have caused some tension, the hospital is only following the law.
They do fight for French Canadian interests outside of Quebec a lot more than they used to. And when they do that, they mostly find that they are pushing against an open door because most of the Canadian establishment also supports the fight for French Canadian interests outside of Quebec. Which brings us back to the original question. Is the French language uniquely important to Canada? In one of my earlier videos, I talked about how this question is very much bound up in what they call the two founding nations theory. This theory takes the form of a patriotic fable that Canada is like at its essence, at its core, a marriage between French and English people. Now, I reject this theory just because I do not think it is a very historically accurate way of describing the sort of country that Canada is. Canada's existence as a bicultural country, where the majority of residents were clearly either of French descent or English descent, was really quite brief. As I explained in my video on Wilfrid Laurier, the moment that Canada annexed the entire northwestern half of this continent in the late 19th century, the country was basically permanently transformed. Immigration skyrocketed, and the fundamental demographic realities of this country permanently changed. Over 2 million immigrants came to Canada to settle the Western territories. The immigration rate climbed so high, it actually increased Canada's population by a full third. In other words, Canada soon stopped being a country of just French Canadians and English Canadians. There were now millions of German Canadians and Russian Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians and all the rest. And then a second great wave of demographic change came to Canada in the late 20th century, and very much continues to this day, in which we have once again adopted one of the highest rates of per capita immigration of any country on earth. And as a result, what the French Canadians enjoy today is a form of, and get ready because this is a very trendy word, privilege. Simply because they are the descendants of Canada's first minority, they have been entrenched in Canadian law as the single most important Canadian minority for all time. A minority that we are supposed to care about more than the many other minorities in Canada today. In defending his decision to not build the French university, Premier Ford allegedly said this: there are 600,000 Francophones in Ontario, but there are also 600,000 Chinese and 600,000 Italians. And in response, Premier Legault of Quebec said this: I made it clear to Mr. Ford that I didn't like that Francophones were being compared to the Chinese or other cultures. I told him that we are one of the two founding peoples of Canada, so we have to expect services to be delivered. So in other words, even though Ontario's French minority is not any bigger than any of the other minority groups, Premier Ford is still expected to build them a university because French. And it's really not a much more sophisticated argument than that. By the most cold-hearted, rationalistic, objective assessment, French is really not that useful of a language to speak in the 21st century, particularly on this continent. It is a language spoken only by a rather small percentage of people living on this planet, most of whom are likely to be multilingual Europeans who can also speak English. It is not a particularly helpful language in the realm of global science or commerce or technology or politics. It is simply a language that is important in Canada because Canada's leaders have understood Canadian history in a deeply flawed way and then crafted public policy around that flawed understanding. And if I may ratchet up the rhetoric a bit, I do think that putting such a flawed understanding at the heart of the Canadian state is really going to cause some very severe problems for Canada if not resolved. For starters, Quebec's obsession with preserving the French language and creating a perfect French society has obviously enabled a lot of xenophobia and chauvinism in that province. Immigrants to Quebec are selected in a far more discriminatory way than they are in the rest of Canada, and there is a great deal more pressure placed on them to assimilate, both in terms of speaking French, but also integrating into perceived French cultural norms.
Legault campaigned on a promise to expel newcomers who don't pass French language and values tests within 3 years. On the contentious topic of religious neutrality, the CAQ wants to go further than the Liberals did and pass a secular charter that would ban teachers, police officers, and judges from wearing religious symbols, including the hijab.
This causes a lot of tension because while this is going
still
on,
working
the
on
rest
that.
of Canada is supposedly embarking on this journey to become the most diverse, multicultural, postmodern country ever. Prime Minister Trudeau once even famously said that he envisions Canada as being the world's first post-national state. There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada, he once told the New York Times. Okay, but as we've seen, the French Canadians clearly believe that they have a core identity and a mainstream, and their government is working very hard to enforce and defend it. This seems like it should cause something of a dilemma for Liberal politicians like Justin Trudeau, particularly since he relies so heavily on Quebec votes to get elected. But luckily, Liberal politicians like Prime Minister Trudeau have found a way to square this circle, and it is called massive hypocrisy. Quebec is just judged by a different standard because French. Let me tell you one of the weirdest ways that this hypocrisy manifests. You are now actually starting to get English Canadian white nationalist types like Faith Goldie actively envy what the Quebecers have, and as a result, a lot of anger towards Trudeau for not letting the English Canadians have the same thing.
According to Justin Trudeau, anyone who is against immigration is racist. Unless they're from Quebec, then they're worthy of his help and a new deal. So a couple of weeks ago, Quebec's premier met with Justin Trudeau and presented him with an ambitious proposal to lower the province's immigration rate by 20% across the board, even as Ottawa promotes higher immigration.
The video actually ends with Faith Goldie wanting to move to Quebec. God, this is a strange country. Anyway, the point is the strength of any left-wing political coalition in Canada can only survive as long as English Canadian progressives just turn a blind eye to Quebec's obviously more chauvinistic and xenophobic culture. Either that or the English Canadian left just has to use this weird value system in which one very privileged group of white people are understood to forever sit atop Canada's grand hierarchy of minorities. Ticking time bomb number 2 is related and has to do with the very high barriers to political participation non-French minorities face in this country. I talked about this a bit in my video on official bilingualism, but basically, because Canada has chosen to treat French as this very, very important thing, to the point of requiring French fluency for basically any government job of importance, Canada's political system is inherently biased towards French Canadians at the expense of everyone else. For example, imagine you're a young Canadian kid born to 2 parents who immigrated from Hong Kong to Vancouver. You grow up speaking Cantonese to your friends and family, but obviously you become fluent in English as well in order to function in broader Vancouver society. But then if you decide you one day want to become an important figure in your country's government, the Canadian system turns around and says you have to become fluent in French as well, a third language with basically no relevance to your day-to-day life. I mean, according to the most recent Canadian census, there are only 70,000 British Columbians who claim French as their mother tongue, compared to 200,000 who claim Cantonese. In fact, if we add up all of the British Columbians who speak an immigrant language as their mother tongue, we see it dramatically dwarfs the number that speak French, 70,000 versus 1.3 million. It is and will continue to be very difficult to justify a political system that places very high barriers to participation on these people while giving express entry to these ones. Now, obviously, it is possible that a child of immigrants could become some sort of trilingual superstar, but considering that even the vast majority of white, unilingual, English-speaking Canadians will never gain the opportunity to become fluent in French, we are really talking about a tiny, tiny sliver of the population at this point. Most people of color who have been successful in Canadian politics have not been fluent in French, and this fact has almost certainly hurt their political careers. Consider someone like Bardish Chagger, a child of immigrants from India who speaks fluent Punjabi as well as English. When Prime Minister Trudeau made her House Majority Leader in 2016, she was immediately criticized for not speaking French, and this glass ceiling will obviously hold her back from rising any higher. I mean, they sometimes force her to read French for public statements and stuff, but I don't think this is fooling anyone.
What's her name?
A child of immigrants from India.
Shut up. They fired her?
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his new cabinet a week ago now, and absent in it was former Cabinet Minister Waterloo MP Bardish Chagger. She joins me now to talk about that decision. Bardish, first off, thank you for joining me. What did you make of the decision by the Prime Minister, and what was your reaction to being left out?
Well, first of all, I do want to appreciate and thank all the good people in the riding of Waterloo for re-electing me as a member of Parliament. Waterloo, representing the diverse voices in Waterloo, has always been my priority, and it remains my focus. The cabinet is always a prerogative of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has chosen to do cabinets. I know that we have a vision for the future of our country that I wholeheartedly support for Waterloo and Canada.
Bardish, do you believe that the situation with We Charity and some of the criticism that you faced as part of that controversy played a role at all in the Prime Minister's decision?
Listen, I'm not going to speculate. What I do know is that the good people of the riding of Waterloo is my priority and my focus. Waterloo has 3 post-secondary institutions. I often say that in Waterloo, our best natural renewable resource is our people, and that includes youth and students. And we put out an impressive package to ensure that we had Canadians' backs, and that's what we're going to continue doing, and that's what I'm going to continue doing.
Now, Bardish, I think many in the region were proud that the region was represented in cabinet and had a minister that they could call their own. I'm curious what you make of the situation now that there is no regional representation in cabinet, and in fact, there's no representation from across southwestern Ontario. What do you make of that reality?
I think it's important for everyone within the region to know that we have a hard-working team of members of Parliament. We have elected officials at all different levels of government that are working together to ensure that this region is well represented, because this region deserves that. So we're going to continue working really hard to ensure that the voices of our region are heard at every level of government, including the federal level. And just today, we saw Minister Algebra, the Minister of Transportation, come. YKF is one of the airports that is going to see international flights landing as of the end of this month, because, you know, it's important that we actually rebound when it comes to our economy. And Canada's economy is, I would say, really, really important, because our region has to succeed to help Canada succeed. So we are going to continue fighting for this community. So rest assured, you have strong voices that are going to fight for you.
For yourself, Bardish, you talk about, fighting for local constituents. How does not being in cabinet change your approach to the work you do with constituents and then the work that will happen in Parliament?
I will say I'm going to redouble my efforts. My focus has always been on the constituents of the riding of Waterloo, and we're going to continue doing that. I am going to work with this cabinet, with this government, to ensure that we deliver for Waterloo.
Bardish, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. That is
very informative. Oh. Oh.
It's a feeling of pride of being able to bring a first Canadian-grown vaccine, if approved, to be used in the fight against COVID-19.
Vaccinations at Montreal sites like this one have been filled with shots from international pharmaceutical giants. But in the next year, it may be possible that a COVID-19 vaccine made in La Belle Province could be rolling through here, as Quebec City-based Medicago announced positive clinical trial results on the safety and efficacy of their plant-based vaccine.
Overall efficacy was 71%. And when we measured the efficacy against the Delta strain specifically, we measured an efficacy of 75.3%.
Though the newly discovered Omicron variant wasn't circulating during the trial period, experts say the results of the placebo-controlled study are promising. 75% efficacy is still very good, and especially if it prevents severe disease, that's also very good efficacy. So it's going to be a very useful vaccine if the data, once the data is formally out.
Today, we are announcing that we extend the third dose to new groups. Today, chronic illnesses or people with health problems, increasing the risk of complication from COVID, people from isolated and remote communities, health workers, and pregnant women. This group total approximately
I was hoping that you could maybe explain for our viewers in English this very nuanced position that you're taking for Christmas gatherings. You say you're now increasing it up to 20, but you also mentioned that you don't have to invite 20 people, that you would prefer if you kept the gatherings small or did it in like a restaurant somewhere where they're demanding the vaccine code. Can you just explain what your position is?
Okay. Well, I think the key point today is that we are keeping all the same measures that we have right now, to one exception, which is the private gathering in houses. And the change that we announced based on the recommendation of Dr. Arruda and his team is to increase the actual limit from 10 to 20. But there is a firm recommendation that those people should be vaccinated. And we strongly recommend not to have unvaccinated people in those gatherings for obvious reasons. With regards to restaurants, bars, we're asking, especially over the next few weeks where there are some parties that are related to office parties, and we're just asking people to really follow the measures, because we've seen, as we know, that in the last few weeks, some office parties, people, they stand up, they sing, and this is contrary to the good measures that we're asking. We're trying to, can I say, land at Christmas at the best numbers that we can have. But it's very clear that we want to limit up to 20 people in private gathering for Christmas.
Do you have anything to add, Dr.
The only
Rubin?
nuance, and I think everything said was great, is that you are not obliged to do a 20. If you want to do a 12, do a 12. You know, I just want to make sure that less people you are, less is your risk. So you can go up to 20, but if you are afraid or if you have special conditions, perhaps you would prefer to be 10 or 7. You know, that's what I want to make, because more people you contact, more risk we have.
Fucking serious.
I was hoping that you could maybe explain
So in June, it was announced that the Canadian Council of Bishops and national Indigenous organizations, including the AFN, would send delegates to meet the Pope. The trip was planned for the week of December 18th, but now has been postponed out of concerns over the threat of the new COVID-19 variant. The health and well-being of our delegates, their families, and communities is paramount to us, and we will not put anyone in harm's way if we can help it. We did call on the church to make a number of reparations while these interactions are occurring. These immediate actions include returning diocese lands properties back to First Nations on whose traditional lands they are situated, and an investment in long-term healing initiatives beyond their commitment of $30 million, which was announced in September, to make sure that support programs and services are available for survivors and their dependents. Over 100 years of church efforts have resulted in the destruction of the social fabric of First Nations. And now equal time, energy, and resources must be made available to rebuild our children's lives, our families, and our communities. I have also, on behalf of the AFN executive, and I am one of the many national chiefs who is asking and who has asked the Holy Father to renounce and formally revoke the Inter Cetera, the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery, and to replace it with a new papal bull that decrees that Indigenous peoples and cultures are valuable, worthy, and must be treated with dignity and respect. Like many of you, we are looking forward to meeting Pope Francis on the traditional lands here on Turtle Island when he does decide to come and visit us. So in Canadian Council...
You guys, fuck. You guys are good.
So in June, it was announced that...
Yep.
I'm very excited for this, Dr. Romney. This was our first ever Med Circle Live event, and I can see people joining us right now. Welcome. Awesome. And we posted one Instagram post on our Instagram, and I thought, 100 slots. That's plenty, and it was sold out in a couple hours and it was done. And so we had to open more slots. It's great. I hope
I hope a lot of people get their questions answered because that's information's power. So
yes. Well, as people start to log on, thank you for being here. I know a lot of you are brand new to Med Circle. Maybe you've seen a couple of Dr. Romney's videos on YouTube. Maybe you've go in depth, and I want to make sure that the majority of our time today is spent answering your questions. The questions you have specifically related to personality disorders and how you can be a better supporter in your relationships, a better supporter for the individual who has a personality disorder or is living with one. And if you're someone living with a personality disorder, perhaps some self-help strategies from Dr. Romney on that as well. Well, we're almost at 86 people. I'm going to give people a couple minutes. I know it's cornered. I've got my computer's on a sheet, on a pile of sheets right now. So I've got my own little home set office. So we'll give people a little bit of time to get in here. Naomi, thank you so much. Dr. Romney, people are chatting in the chat. So people are very excited to see you. You guys are more than welcome to chat using the chat button at the bottom. If you have a question for Dr. Romney, however, use the Q&A button at the bottom. You can submit your question from there, and we'll get to as many as possible. I'm going to give them one more minute, Dr. Romney, but as people are coming in, what are you hoping to accomplish when we talk about personality disorders today?
Well, a couple of things is that, number one, as we know, and, my work is very much on narcissism in general, is that today I think is a special focus specifically on personality disorders. So we really are talking about people who may, you're seeing someone who might, a person you're in a relationship with, family member with, who has been getting therapy for this? Because odds are they wouldn't know they have a personality disorder unless they've been formally diagnosed.
Right.
And if people do have questions like, what's the difference? How do I know if they have a disorder or not? I'll talk about that. But I think that what ends up happening is that personality disorders are very unique in the relationship space because there's such a risk of people personalizing what happens in this. And, just as like, imagine you were in a relationship with somebody who was living with a substance use disorder, okay? Yep. So they may wake up wake up very late and be very irritable until they're using again. A lot of people wouldn't personalize that irritability. They say, they're an addict. They got to get their drugs and they're not getting their drug. And they wouldn't blame themselves. Interestingly, with the personality disorders, people blame themselves when they're in those relationships. Because again, personality disorders, by definition, particularly the ones, I shouldn't say all, the ones that the narcissistic, borderline, those kinds of personality disorders have associated with them a fair amount of interpersonal instability. Interestingly, the other people in those relationships, the person who may not have a personality disorder tends to blame themselves. And so that piece of it is why I want people to understand the boundary between you and them, what responsibility lies with them, and to be very realistic about what it is you can do and how to take good care of yourself in one of these relationships so you can be there with someone but not get lost in the relationship and not get harmed by it.
Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to turn off my air conditioning since it's a little loud. And I think we have a lot of people in our first live event. So excited. I woke up like it was Christmas today. Thank you for putting in your questions. There's a Q&A box on the bottom. Put in your questions there. And if you feel so inspired right now, I'm going to do it, Dr. Ram. You cannot, whatever you want. I am going to just take a picture of myself and put it on social media. One thing that MedCircle is doing, of course.
Take care of the screen?
I'm just going to do one of these, like a selfie. Yeah.
I'm going to take it of the screen because I don't have such capabilities.
There you go.
You always don't quite understand how limited I am. Look, it'll even have the words then. See?
There. I'll get.
I guess I'll try that other thing you just told me to do, but that just feels like a lot to me. Yeah, I look a little crazy, but my kids would say, "Why don't you know how to do this?" But there we go. All right, I got it.
Mental health can be a personal journey. It can be one you share with family and friends. I by no means want to pressure anybody to share what they're doing here today. But for those of you who do feel comfortable sharing that you took time out of your day today to get educated on mental health, that is a really courageous and proud thing to share, I think. So if you feel strongly about that, tag me, tag Dr. Ramani, tag MedCircle, and we'll connect on social media after this. But let's get into this discussion about personality disorders. What types of relationship issues do you see in your practice, Dr. Ramani, treating personality disorders in regards to how that affects the relationship?
So I work predominantly with survivors of relationships, or people who are in relationships, either, if not full-blown personality disorders, with relatively difficult personality patterns. And these are often high conflict, antagonistic, dysregulated, manipulative kinds of relationships. And many people have been in these relationships for years and have been second guessing themselves and been confused and assuming it was them and wondering what they're doing wrong for years. My goal has often been in working with clients is to educate them about these patterns, because sometimes that actually clears up most of the other, saying, oh, I didn't even know this was a thing. I thought I was doing something wrong. Especially when, and again, I talk about this word a lot, so we might as well get it out, right in the beginning, so I'll use it, is gaslighting. Gaslighting is a classical part of any relationship with somebody who has a lot of personality stuff going on. And gaslighting is the denial of another person's reality. It can take several forms, including literally denying reality. I never said that. I never did that. And yet you literally have the text message in your hand where they said that. It might be things like you're being too sensitive. You have no right to feel that way. You're the one who has a problem. It's definitely, it's a deflection. They'll minimize it. You're making too big a deal about this. And that tends to be the landscape of a relationship with somebody who has really personality issues, particularly narcissistic personality issues. And so it's helping clear the air and help them understand that's what gaslighting is. Your reality is being played with. That's why you're so confused. And for most people, Kyle, these are what we call legacy issues. They're issues that started in childhood. They either had one or two narcissistic or other high conflict, difficult personality parents. And that can set a person up for thinking this kind of relationship manipulation is normal. In fact, abuse equals love, the trauma bonded kind of situation. So it's helping people understand that history. In addition, people who do have histories of trauma are actually more vulnerable to entering these relationships with people with high conflict personalities and getting stuck in them as though this is what love is supposed to be, confusing and upside down, and I feel bad about myself and all of that. Like all of those things are almost equated in this toxic stew of love. It's helping a person create a new paradigm of what a loving relationship is supposed to look like.
When we talk about personality disorders on MedCircle, narcissism seems to be the most sought out topic of the personality disorders. After that, we have borderline personality disorder. Very briefly, what is that?
Which one, narcissism or borderline personality?
BPD, borderline.
Okay, so borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder characterized by instability. Instability in emotion, instability in mood, instability in behavior, and instability in relationships. The person experiencing borderline personality disorder really, really suffers with a sense of internal chaos almost at all times. And all of this is very much fueled by a chronic fear of abandonment. In classical, pure borderline personality disorder, the person is not only terrified of abandonment, but really often very much devalues themselves. There's a lot of despair in this. So there's the assumption of I'm no good, I'm worthless. Of course, people are going to leave me. What do I need to do to keep them close? And because of that, there can sometimes be a sort of desperation in their communication, and that can put other people off. Many people may feel manipulated in these relationships, and it's not. More often than not, it's not intentional on the part of somebody with pure borderline personality disorder, in the sense that they don't know how to appropriately reach out to someone, because imagine they're in a sense of panic. And that's the best way I can describe it. A person with borderline personality disorder often feels so much panic that they feel like they're drowning. So when they go to be with their supporter, the supporter feels like they're going to go down with them, although they're trying to rescue them from drowning. Anyone knows that. It's sort of drowning 101 is sort of like you have to get a person in a kind of a hold and get them out of danger. But the borderline individual, the person with that personality disorder, often feels like they're drowning, and they feel panicked, and they feel in a chronic sense of psychological pain. It's an incredibly difficult pattern and difficult legacy to carry. So it can be very confusing for supporters of a person with borderline personality.
Dr. Ramani has a few series on borderline personality disorder at MedCircle. At the end of this stream, if you're watching live, I'm going to provide some discount codes if you do not have a MedCircle membership, so you can access those series and more. If you're watching this on replay, you can fast forward if you want to get there. Otherwise, it'll be at the end of this video. I want to go through avoidant personality, Dr. Ramani, paranoid personality, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And could you talk about very briefly what those are and maybe some of the relationship struggles that can come with the disorder?
So those are all very different kinds of personality disorders. I most often speak about, for example, narcissistic personality disorder, a little less about borderline, but narcissistic and borderline personality sort of live in the same section of the diagnostic world, again, very much characterized by, instability, dysregulation, that sort of thing. When we talk about paranoid personality, we're in a different area of sort of the personality and the personality disorder kind of world. People with paranoid personality disorder literally do always feel like people are out to get them, that people are watching them, people are talking about them. They're very suspicious, they're very mistrustful to a degree that it's getting in the way of being able to establish any kind of meaningful relationship, collaboration, anything like that with anyone. You could imagine a relationship with somebody who has paranoid personality disorder, it's all but impossible. The person with paranoid personality will seem very almost victimized. They always feel people are out to get them. And as a result, they can people can experience them as very combative and oppositional. Like, they're out to get me and they're talking about me, or you're out to get me and your friends are out to get me. And you'll feel like, I can't. I mean, it's almost like it feels impossible to integrate a person with that kind of personality into your life. And as you can imagine, close relationships are not going to be the strong suit of someone with a paranoid personality. My guess is actually that people may run into this more in a family member. So in other words, not a relationship that they chose, but a relationship with someone who's already built into their life, like a sibling or potentially a parent. That lives in a part of the personality disorder world that almost tends to be a little bit more odd and unusual behavior that almost feels on the low end of psychotic, but it's not. It's just, again, this incredible suspiciousness. What's interesting is that suspiciousness and almost paranoid suspiciousness can carry through narcissistic personality. So some people might be saying, how do I know the difference between the two? It can be because the person with paranoid personality won't have the grandiosity, the entitlement, they won't have those things, okay? But many people with narcissistic personality styles or narcissistic personality disorder can be incredibly sensitive to criticism to a level that it looks paranoid. And because they're so insecure, people with narcissism are so insecure, they kind of think everyone's out to get them, out to steal their ideas, out like they're like, they literally want people to sign non-disclosure agreements when they walk in their front door. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is going out to dinner. And so there's that's also seen in narcissistic personality too. Now, when we jump the rails to these other two disorders you're talking about, avoidant personality and obsessive compulsive personality. Avoidant personality disorder is more of an anxious presenting personality style. People with avoidant personality disorder actually look a lot like they have another kind of mental illness called social anxiety disorder. People with avoidant personality very much want to be with other people, but they're so afraid of negative scrutiny, that they're going to look foolish, that people are going to criticize them. They're so afraid of that they either don't put themselves into a social realm or they avoid the situations altogether, thus the name avoidant. But the trick, and I don't like the name of that because actually people with avoidant personality want to spend time with other people, but they feel so socially unskilled that they hold back. Or when they do engage, there's a sort of an awkwardness about it, and they may even agree to do things that they're not necessarily comfortable with, just so they feel like they could fit in. People with avoidant personality may also have a greater risk, for example, of using alcohol to kind of lubricate social situations so they feel a little bit looser and more comfortable. So that's, and now for people with avoidant personality, relationships can be difficult, but I don't think impossible. I think a person may experience them as very slow to warm up, very socially anxious, may regularly sort of seek reassurance. Like, is this a good idea? Like, we'll do anything you want. And so it has an almost dependent feel to it. But what a person in a relationship with someone with avoidant personality may see is that it's very difficult to bring this person into a larger social group. You're like, hey, let's go to this party. They're like, oh, no, thank you. And so it might be the kind of thing where you may get into a relationship like this, but sort of helping this person into larger social situations and issues like that might be harder. And then going to the last personality pattern, you talked about obsessive compulsive personality. First of all, I want to distinguish that from obsessive compulsive disorder. They're actually pretty different. Mm-hmm. Obsessive compulsive disorder has more of an anxiety feel to it. People who have intrusive, unwanted thoughts and engage in behaviors to help ease their anxiety, such as washing their hands or checking a lock or ensuring that there's a lot of symmetry in their world. People with obsessive compulsive disorder also seek out reassurance a lot, and they're very plagued by doubt. That's very different than obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Again, a very unfortunately named person. All the personality disorders, by the way, were badly named. I don't know if the DSM people were like out to lunch or what the heck was going on with it, but they're all badly named, okay? But so if I named them all, I would call obsessive compulsive personality disorder sort of, pathologically rigid or something like that, because that's what it is. It's characterized by rigidity, perfectionism, self-righteousness, hyper high levels of morality, and a judgmental quality. And probably the thing that is most common in people with obsessive compulsive personality is they're workaholics. They work all the time. They derive a lot of their identity from working. They judge people who don't work as hard. They work to the detriment of their family, their relationships, everything, okay? And so people with obsessive compulsive personality are really stingy with money. Like if you go and get 2 cups of coffee with them and maybe you got a large and they got a small, they'll expect you to give the extra 50 cents for the large coffee. Like they're really, they get into the minutia of those things and they keep records of all that stuff. And again, there's a mean, miserly almost quality to them. And so not exactly very easy to have a relationship with because there's a lot of judgment. There is this miserliness. There's this they're cheap, but I don't mean cheap money, just cheap with everything. Cheap with their time, cheap with their affection, cheap with their warmth. It's just sort of this kind of like, I don't even know how to describe it, like this holding back and restrictive quality. They're very, very rigid. If you have a date at 6 and you got stuck in traffic, they'll say, well, I'm canceling the date because I said 6, so no date. So it'll feel really, really rigid and uncomfortable. They'll give you a gift and they'll say, well, we decided to spend $50 on gifts, so please don't spend more than that. Oh, this year I spent $75 on your gift, so next year I'm only going to spend $25 on your gift. Like, they'll go there. They will go there. Yeah. Not an easy relationship to have. People with narcissism can have overlaps into that obsessive compulsive space.
Yes. Okay. So we've talked briefly then today about narcissistic personality disorder and the traits of narcissism, borderline personality disorder, avoidant, paranoid, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Bridget is on this chat as well. She is our producer. She's going to throw a poll up in front of you guys. If there are any personality disorders that we would like to talk about, that we have not talked about, please vote very quickly so we can give some attention to the one with the highest vote. So you should see that on your screen. Somebody, while that's going on, Dr. Ramade, somebody asked a question on the differences between avoidant personality disorder and social anxiety.
Okay, it's a very difficult differential. In fact, each year I always put my students in my abnormal psych class, like to help discern that difference. I actually think the main difference would be what we call pervasiveness and severity. People with avoidant personality, it's a much more severe kind of a presentation. Like they're more limited by their social anxiety. It cuts across more different kinds of situations. And so because of that pervasiveness and severity and frankly stability of it, I think people with avoidant personality, it looks more severe. People with social anxiety will actually do pretty well with small groups. So they might do well with their closest best friends, right, with their brothers and sisters, even with a partner they get to know. People with social anxiety will struggle when they're in maybe a larger group. A lot of people with social anxiety only have it in performance situations, like if they have to give a speech. A person with avoidant personality, it's almost like it's hard for them to ever kind of get out of that. And in fact, for some people, actually a bigger issue with the differential is avoidant personality versus autism spectrum. Because we will see that sort of discomfort sometimes in social situations because a person on the spectrum is going to have many, many other sort of social processing and potentially other issues. That differential becomes clear, but in some cases it's not always clear, particularly a person who's on the spectrum but is functioning in workplaces and all of that.
So by a landslide, most people chose borderline personality disorder to discuss further. So can you talk about this more than anybody? You probably don't even need to be asking questions. What do people need to know when they are in a relationship with somebody who is living with BPD? How can they be a great person for themselves and their partner?
Couple of things. Okay, one thing I want to say, because this is actually, and I'm going to be frank with you, Kyle, a very angry email I've gotten more than a few times. And so I want to open with this point because I think that there are people living with borderline personality who think I don't understand this correctly. And I apologize because I think I didn't articulate it correctly. One of the biggest struggles is how to understand empathy in a person who has borderline personality. Here's the bottom line. People with borderline personality have almost too much empathy most of the time. They break themselves in trying to be there for other people and listen to them, and really will actually put themselves at risk and harm to be there for other people. Where it gets problematic is when the distress for a person living with borderline personality becomes so overwhelming. They're so despairing, they're so fearful, they feel so worthless, and they feel so awful about themselves. At those times, they're terrified, and it feels like their empathy has gone away. It hasn't really gone away. It's almost like it's being eclipsed by this internal pain that that person with borderline personality is feeling. Then the person with borderline personality feels intense remorse at not having been appropriately empathic at the time they were distressed, and then they feel even more worthless, and you see how that cycle plays out. So to anyone who has heard that, if it has anyone on this call, I do want to be ensured that that got heard properly, because I may have said it quickly once and it may have come out insensitively, so I apologize, because I work with clients who live with borderline personality. I know how despairing they are, how much pain they are in. It is incredibly difficult for them. So I think let's start with that. Number one, this person is in a tremendous amount of pain. Okay. Yes. And so I can't just explain it. It's as though they're drowning, and these voices in their head are just saying, you are no good and everyone's going to leave you, and it feels real. Okay.
Well, I interviewed someone with BPD, and they told it to me like this. They said, imagine trying to feel whole, to feel full, but no matter how much you felt, you filled yourself up, it was like shoveling dirt into a bottomless pit. They could never feel full, but craving that their whole life.
Yes, craving that, and often very so kind, almost too kind. Here's the paradox of a person with borderline personality classically, and I am talking about pure borderline, okay? And some people call it quiet borderline, all right? There's a variant of borderline I can get to in a moment that can sometimes get more challenging. But in the case of sort of the pure, quiet borderline, okay, that the person is in so much pain, and they will be so kind, almost too kind to other people. They give the best of themselves to other people. Yeah. They have so much empathy for other people. I work with people who have borderline personality, who are healthcare providers and who are teachers. When I tell you, they don't go the extra mile, they go the extra 1,000 miles, but then they exhaust themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the struggle, is helping them find that balance of, I tell any borderline client, a person living with borderline I work with, can you be as kind to yourself as you are to me and to everyone else? If we could even get you there, like, we'd be so good. And so,
well, you guys, that's a moment. I mean, there's 165 people watching this live right now. Every single person who just heard that, I don't care if you've never been told you were even close to BPD. Why wouldn't we all take that advice? Remember that.
Yeah,
we most don't lie to ourselves.
And people who live with borderline personality they're so kind of cruel to themselves. So I think that if somebody's living with someone with borderline personality, you've got to stop, be mindful, and catch yourself and recognize this person is in pain. And before you start yelling at them and getting impatient with them, it's no more than you would scream at anyone who isn't, like somebody who's bleeding in front of you. You wouldn't yell at them and say, stop that bleeding. You would say, how can I help you? And you would get down and you would help them. So I say to people who are supporters of and love people and care for people who have borderline personality, breathe and understand they're not acting this way to ruin your day. They're hurting. And that's number one. Number two is it's absolutely essential that you encourage and support their attendance and treatment. And I would say, if you're supporting someone, whether this is your partner, your friend, a family member, please read about it. There's some magnificent books out there about borderline personality. You know, there's one, it's called the Essential Family Guide to Borderline Personality. Read it. Because if you can understand this, then it may be an opportunity to say, I get this, and this is what's happening now. I was recently talking with someone with borderline personality, and she said, I am about to get really angry at you and yell at you, and it's because I am falling apart inside, and I'm in so much pain. I don't know what to do with the pain. I actually thought that was great, because I'll tell you what ended up happening for me was I was prepared, and I understood she was in pain. So while it wasn't easy to listen to, I knew it wasn't targeted at me. I happened human being with
Right.
right now. And I thought, from a loving place, instead of making it personal, let me just reassure and say, it's okay. Is there something else we could be doing? Would you like a little time and space for yourself? And I'll just be in the other room, kind of thing, to let them know you can be safe. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to run away from you. But what would help you? How can I help you now? Watching your tone of voice and all of that to understand, again, there is a lot of despair. But on the flip side, Kyle, you also need to take care of yourself, because it can be difficult taking care of somebody or loving somebody who may at times lash out at you. And so you want to be a good supporter. How are you a good supporter? You take care of you, just as I want the person who's living with borderline personality to learn to take care of them. But that's going to be a requirement of any person. So it's somebody, I noticed that somebody made a comment about the book Walking on Eggshells. That's also another important book, because it really does deconstruct how to communicate with someone who's living with borderline personality without personalizing it. Because that's the key. This isn't personal. They are struggling with something. And so it is not about you. It's about them.
Yes, I love that. It's not about you. It is about them.
It's their journey. It's their experience. Yeah.
I want to go right into our questions. I want to get to as many as we can. Our first question comes from an anonymous attendee. How do I tell if you're gaslighting yourself? And how do we recognize the difference between our own anxieties or paranoia, if you will, versus someone gaslighting us? What if we're so far gone that you now lose trust in everyone and yourself and become as hypersensitive as a narcissist?
Catch yourself. The first time you say to yourself, I think I'm being too sensitive. I think I'm making too big a deal of this. Stop, pay attention, and ask yourself the question. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. But maybe, take a step back and say, okay, let me break this down. Because the minute you say, I think I'm being too sensitive, there's a real strong likelihood you are gaslighting yourself. So then break down the situation in front of you and say, what is happening here? What was the stimulus? How am I reacting to this? Do I have all of the information? So it's all of those things that you to be aware of. How are you reacting in the situation? But take every gaslighting statement that's ever been said to you. You're being too sensitive. That never happened. You're making too big a deal. And if you're saying things like, maybe I'm being too sensitive, maybe I'm wrong, maybe that never did happen, maybe I am making too big a deal out of this, odds are you are gaslighting yourself. And at that moment, catch yourself, stop, and ask the question, how am I reading this situation? It's really about learning to be present with yourself. I tell people that one of the most sacred parts of yourself is your reality. Don't let anyone take that away. And here's the thing, to say I'm being too sensitive is to judge your own reaction. It's to judge your own reaction. And so to me, that's a judgment, and that's not healthy. Who's to say there's no sensitivity meter in the world? There really isn't. So once you say, no, I am feeling, I am having a feeling. If you change, maybe I'm being too sensitive into, I'm feeling hurt now. I'm feeling anxious now. Turn it into the I am feeling statement. Now you've brought yourself back into your reality. And instead of judging your feeling, you're naming your feeling. I think that's a great way to push back on gaslighting. Self-gaslighting.
No, I get it. You told me that once. We did it's on YouTube, a live therapy session, you and me on my issues, and you go, Kyle, you're judging your own feelings and your own emotions. I go, oh my God, I totally am. Totally doing that. Great question. Thank you for doing that. Let's go to our next question. Guys, when you thumb up a question, it goes to the top. So if you see a question that you really like, give it a thumbs up. Why are psychopathic and sociopathic people and people with BPD attracted to each other? And what are the long-term